Hi everyone, welcome to our channel Bay. Douglas Macgregor highlights the recurring pattern preceding major crises or conflicts in U.S. history. Amnesia. He asserts that these events often stem from a dismissal of the necessity to systematically study the operational regions and understand potential opponents. Macgregor suggests there's a lack of interest in others' perspectives, particularly from Washington and the globalist community, including Europe's leadership. He argues that their pursuits are driven by ideological objectives aimed at destabilizing Russia for its refusal to open borders, abandon national identity, and submit to Western financial and military dominance. That's the simplest way to perceive it. An important point is being raised here at some juncture. Someone must have had the insight to pause and ask, what is the genuine objective? The real aim, they say, is to undermine Russia, to topple Putin. It brings to mind Anthony Eden's stance. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, he informed Field Marshal Montgomery, who was possibly the chief of the Imperial General Staff or had retired by then, that they intended to intervene in Egypt. Montgomery queried why. For what purpose? Eden's response was to oust Nasser from power. Montgomery found this notion absurd. It lacked coherence. How did they plan to achieve it? What were they trying to shape in the country?
Chaos.
Civil unrest. Their desire was for it to crumble, given the real possibilities inherent in what was being proposed. Setting aside the question of its achievability, why would the rest of the world endorse such an endeavor? It's evident it fell on deaf ears. Anthony Eden proceeded. They entered the Suez. And what ensued? Catastrophe. The entire venture was a debacle. They were unprepared. They failed to comprehend the situation. In that instance, they greatly overestimated the Egyptians, yet they neglected to lay the groundwork. They lacked a strategy. Their objectives were vague beyond the desire to oust Nasser. We find ourselves in a similar predicament now. Of course, Anthony Eden's mindset was influenced by his perceptions of Hitler in the 1930 epoch, which had no relevance to Nasser or the Suez Crisis. Presently, we are inclined to view Putin as a Stalinist figure, and the Russian army is another Soviet replica. This perspective is flawed and illogical. However, beneath it all, there exists a faction of affluent individuals. What you might call oligarchs in the East are hedge fund billionaires. Elsewhere, they have a vested interest in gaining access to Russia's vast resources. Hence, any efforts to destabilize the regime and fragment the country are, in their estimation, financially lucrative. There isn't much left to ponder if you revisit an interview I had with Dmitry Simes back in January, or I believe it was alongside his co-host George Beebe, a former CIA officer. We discussed predictions before this entire ordeal began. Like many others, one of my forecasts was incorrect. I stated that the Russians would absolutely intervene. I was right about that. I also predicted that Nato would collapse by the end of it. This was in January of 2022. The one aspect I and many others misjudged was the careful, deliberate, and cautious manner in which the Russians proceeded. Naturally, we weren't privy to the instructions from the Russian General Staff or the President. Putin, who truly didn't desire war, attempted something. You'll advise for a heed of state-sending signals. He sought to communicate with the West. He never anticipated the extent of corruption and hostility among the globalist elites in Europe and the United States. He assumed that once things began, people would voice opposition to a war in Europe. I recall my time as an officer in the 1990s, particularly during the Coastal Air Campaign. Conversations with colleagues from Dutch, German, French, and other forces revealed a consensus. NATO was established to prevent wars in Europe, not to incite them. However, reality dictates otherwise. This conflict has been orchestrated from the outset by Washington, with backing from London and Paris. Europeans will pay a heavy toll. The sooner they awaken to this reality and, frankly, disengage from us, the better off they'll be. but that's a matter for them to resolve. What's disconcerting to me is the lack of concern. Washington in particular seems indifferent. I grew up alongside Ukrainians in North Philadelphia, and I held them in high regard. They, along with Poles, Lithuanians, and others, shaped my perspective. My fascination with Europe led me to study in Germany, where I became equally enthralled with the people. Given the circumstances of the time, our attention naturally turned towards the Russians. So, I've been endeavoring from the outset to comprehend all these individuals and groups. I'm not entirely sure I've ever fully grasped it, but one thing I can say with absolute certainty is that no one in Washington comprehends any of it. The government in Warsaw has been exceptionally antagonistic toward Russia right from the start. They're ensnared in this emotional hysteria where, on one hand, Russia is deemed evil and any Russian must be obliterated. On the other hand, they perceive themselves as the inevitable imperial masters of much of Ukraine and the broader region. I believe that perception is unraveling now. In fact, I received some information this morning from my acquaintances. One informed me that 52% of Poles have essentially expressed a desire to have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. Some are even saying, well, we'll offer support and aid. But our primary concern in Poland right now is getting millions of Ukrainians out of Poland. That's a significant shift. So I reckon it's going to be very challenging for the Poles to continue serving as America's proxy. Essentially, that's what we attempt to do with Ukraine. They were a proxy for let's push and see how far we can extend toward the Russian border. If we can deploy troops, missiles, and equipment in the east to threaten Russia, that's deemed a positive, then we can intimidate Russia. Unfortunately, we forgot we weren't dealing with Iraq or any of these artificial constructs. But with real nation-states, Russia is a tangible entity. So now we're paying a hefty price. But I think we're learning. And I believe Americans are also learning as they observe. He has always maintained that Kharkov and Odessa would once again be Russian cities. I have no doubt that will come to pass. I believe he's also monitoring the West actions closely. He sees vulnerabilities in Berlin, with Schulz's approval rating hovering around 31%. The German populace is clamoring for a new government. I think the Germans have finally realized they're not only heading into a severe economic downturn, but also being the-industrialized. Their scientific and industrial prowess is being eroded. And once again, the Germans are remarking, well, we weren't really consulted, were we? No one asked us if we wanted to declare war. Instead, we witnessed all these emotional outbursts, like from this woman Baerbock, who acted childishly by refusing to shake Lavrov's hand. The Russian foreign minister Moscow observed all of this and wondered how long before Schulz is gone, how long before Macron is, if the Europeans manage to remove those two. I think you might see some governments stepping forward and saying enough. And then there's Washington, stuck in a quagmire of its own making. No one wants to retract from absurd statements in policy stances. No one wants to admit, this was a real mistake. By the way, it should be noted that we've been deceiving you, and this has been going on for months. Currently, there are approximately 37 Ukrainian brigades positioned all along the defensive line from the south-southeast to the northeast. We estimate that the Ukrainians may have about 6 brigades in reserve, so 64 brigades amount to roughly 24,000 troops, with a little over 100,000 Ukrainians stationed in these defensive positions, where they are consistently under attack and casualties are mounting daily. Simultaneously, the Russians have around 300,000 troops in reserve. Putin has been hesitant to deploy this reserve and swiftly conclude the conflict because he fears that NATO might intervene in western Ukraine. If that were to happen, it would escalate into a full-blown war, a scenario he never desired. However, if compelled, he cannot afford to lose. He cannot allow any remnants of Ukraine to become part of NATO. From the very beginning, Ukraine should have remained neutral and had no business joining NATO. Putin is aware of this. So ultimately, it's a decision for Vladimir Putin to make. He's monitoring all these factors before committing his forces. Lastly, and I know many may find this hard to believe, but it's true Putin doesn't want to cause more Ukrainian casualties. They are Slavic and Orthodox Christian brethren, and he has no interest in harming them. Moreover, he understands the limitations. The F-16S, without airborne warning and control systems crucial for communication and radar capabilities, won't arrive in time to alter the outcome. In my assessment, it's a futile endeavor.